How's it going guys, Kris here, and today I'm going to be giving you the complete guide to the M1 Garand in Battlefield 5, the famous American semi-automatic rifle which came along in the War in the Pacific update, and can be used by the assault class as a primary weapon. So as many of you guys will probably know, the M1 Garand is a pretty well known firearm, being the standard issue US service rifle used by American troops during World War II. And the first semi-automatic rifle to be adopted by a major military power, making it something of an icon. It was adopted by the US Army in 1936, but the gun wasn't actually designed by an American. The guy who did make it was a French-Canadian bloke called John C. Garand, a weapons engineer who migrated to the States at an early age, with a fond interest in guns and machinery. The weapon itself had over a decade of development behind it, and was chambered to fire the 30-06 Springfield round, giving it a fairly decent power output, comparable to some bolt-action rifles, with the likes of the M1903 also utilising this very same cartridge. But of course, the M1 Garand wasn't a bolt-action rifle and could be fired much quicker, with it using a semi-auto mechanism, having an internal magazine built to hold 8 shots at a time, housed by M-block clips. Cartridges would be staggered in said clip, and once the last one gets fired, the clip automatically ejects and the bolt locks to the rear, creating that very distinctive pinging sound. At the time, it was a pretty revolutionary piece of hardware, replacing the M1903 for frontline use, being a very effective but somewhat heavy combat machine in several different conflicts to follow its military adoption. And during the Second World War, approximately up to 5 million copies were produced by the Springfield and Winchester armories, with many more still being made even after the war had ended in 1945. Its popularity in the military has made it a very iconic historical weapon, commonly popping up in a lot of war movies, games, media and literature. Though despite it normally being displayed in its standard form, the M1 rifle did have a few different variants, including sniper versions with optical attachments, along with some experimental carbine variants designed for tank crews, which were a little bit lighter and easier to manage, but never actually saw service in the end. So the M1 Garand in Battlefield 5 actually has 2 different sets of stats connected with its lethality, depending on your specialization choices. Its standard damage model straight out of the gate allows the gun to deal a maximum of 40 damage up to 25 meters, which then sharply drops off to lower figures over distance. This results in it being able to take down players in free shots up to 50 meters, but it'll often take an extra 4th bullet to seal the deal if your opponent is any further away, with damage dropping down to as low as 30 at 75 meters and beyond, giving the weapon a difference of 10 damage between its maximum and minimum values. This is a fairly similar sort of damage pattern to the Turner SMLE and the Model 1944, with the Garand dishing out a teeny bit more damage at range. Not enough to lower its shots to kill though, but it could potentially help when finishing an already weakened target off. With the M1 also firing at the speed of 360 RPM too, this gives it very similar kill times to the Turner and the M1944 as well, making it a very deadly close to mid-range rifle. Though should you apply the heavy load specialization, well, this changes those stats to make those bullets pack more of a punch, but limits the gun's fire rate to just 300 RPM, possibly making it less effective within close quarters, with its fire rate being a bit less spammable. Heavy load buffs the maximum damage to 45 and the minimum to 36, putting its damage model more in line with the Gewehr 43, basically allowing the M1 Garand to drop targets over all ranges with just 3 well-placed bullets, 2 if you land a headshot. So this gives the gun some very different properties, depending on your choice. Now, the base model of the M1 Garand actually has a fairly manageable recoil pattern. It follows the typical trend of having 0 horizontal recoil, which is pretty normal for semi-auto rifles. But it's actually got a tad less vertical recoil than the other similar weapons, with a value of 0.85 and an increased value of 0.01, both relatively low when you compare them to the other semi-auto rifles in the class. So this is going to help make it feel quite stable, easier to control, and probably more usable when you're up against someone further away, especially when you're firing at the gun's maximum rate. The weapon doesn't have any specializations to reduce this recoil, like some of the others do, but taking its fire rate and damage model into consideration, the M1 Garand is a pretty accurate rifle in its standard form. Though there is one specialization that does affect those stats in a negative way: heavy load, which might buff the damage, but along with lowering the fire rate, it also lowers accuracy too. Using heavy load increases the M1's vertical recoil up to 1.25, and gives it a 0.03 degree increase value, generally making the gun kick upwards more when fired, now mirroring the same recoil pattern as the Carabin 1938M. It's not a terrible difference, as the M1 Garand will still cope okay over mid to long ranges, but you might have to fire slightly slower to control this extra kick and account for this higher value. Those 30-06 bullets fly quite quickly through the air, with the Garand having a muzzle velocity of 780 meters per second, a little bit higher than average. So despite not having the high velocity bullet spec, this still makes it ideal for longer ranged engagements, and a decent weapon to use with some mid-ranged optics. So the M1 Garand is yet another clip-loaded semi-automatic rifle, but unlike most of the others in the assault class, the gun uses M-block clips instead of stripper clips. This means that the weapon can't have its internal magazine topped up with individual cartridges, and so the clips will need to be ejected and replaced every time, regardless of whether or not there's any bullets left over. Each of these M-block clips hold a total of 8 rounds, which is actually a lower amount than average, with a lot of the others typically holding up to 10 shots or more. So this might impede its use for aggressive play and make it slightly less suitable for taking on multiple players one after the other, especially if you're using the gun in its base form with that weaker damage output, usually reducing the number of enemies you'll be able to kill at range per reload. Because you can't top the magazine up with extra bullets, you'll have to perform a full reload every time, taking around about 3.3 seconds to do, which is kind of on the lengthy side, considering the rifle doesn't really hold very much ammunition. It might not be ideal in a lot of cases closer to the front lines, but at least it does mean that reloads are going to seem fairly consistent, acting in the same sort of way each time you choose to perform one. However, the M1 Garand does have access to that quick reload specialization, speeding those clip swaps up by 15%, allowing the gun to get the job done a bit quicker, in about 2.8 seconds. This is probably going to seem quite useful for a lot of players, especially if you prefer to play close to all the action, though it still might not be as snappy as a few of the other rifle's detachable mag reloads in the class. So just take that into account before you run into an enemy bunker like a headless chicken. Now let's take a good look at those specialization choices. The two we can find at the top of the tree are the quick aim and barrel bedding options, the first affecting the weapon's speed when aiming down sights, and the other reducing spread when standing still. I guess if you're an aggressive player, you might prefer to use the quick aim spec to get the drop on a nearby target. But because of the smaller mag size, and the fact that it can perform quite well over medium ranges with a scope, I tend to lean towards using barrel bedding more, for that added accuracy advantage. For the middle section of the tree, on the left side, we've got the custom stock and lightened stock options, basically making the gun feel more maneuverable when aiming down sights, and a little bit more accurate too when strafing around. The right side on the other hand consists of the quick reload and enhanced grip specs, speeding up those reloads a bit and improving the hipfire spread. Both sides are going to fit in well with aggressive playstyles, though I normally prefer to go down the right, mainly to make those reloads a bit less punishing, as those 8 rounds can often get depleted really quickly, so cutting the reloads down a little bit can be very beneficial. The hipfire advantage isn't exactly a great bonus for this gun particularly, but it still might help you out in close quarters, if you didn't choose the quick aim option at the start, bypassing the need to aim down those sights. As for the last section of the tree, we're left with the grenade launcher option on the left and that heavy load specialization on the right. The grenade launcher is basically what it says on the tin, giving you extra explosive power to use against your enemies, just like the gadget. You might prefer to use this if you don't want to use the heavy load spec, which changes the gun in a pretty drastic way, making it more suitable for sniping and taking on players in the distance. If you're playing close to the action, then that grenade launcher might be your best bet, though I do prefer the extra firepower that the heavy load option provides. And because I often quite like to equip a scope onto my M1, this goes quite well with its extra damage over range. Plus it also makes those 8 round clips a tad more sustainable too, with it taking less shots to kill over distance. So anyway, in conclusion, the M1 Garand is a pretty special weapon, not just because it's iconic and well known, but because it can actually function in 2 very distinct ways. The normal model of the gun allows it to perform in a similar sort of way to the Turner SMLE, firing at a reasonably quick rate, dealing a decent amount of damage, and generally being fairly effective within close to medium ranges. It's got some of the better recoil patterns of the bunch, kicking upwards slightly less so than a lot of the others, and so this helps to complement aggressive play, as you'll be able to fire at that maximum rate, whilst being able to stay on target a little bit easier. With that said, it's still got a few drawbacks for close quarter combat, like the fact that its reloads can sometimes take a little bit longer to perform, and with it only having the ammo capacity of 8 shots at a time. Not exactly a lot to go wild with. These ammo management issues can sometimes limit the gun's effectiveness within those hectic situations in CQC, but against single targets it should be able to do fine most of the time. The alternate way of using the M1 is by equipping the heavy load specialization, drastically changing the weapon's characteristics and transforming it into a different beast. This should make the gun more compatible with sniping and enhance its performance for longer range takedowns by boosting the damage and taking less shots to kill over distance, but also lowering the fire rate and increasing the recoil, possibly making it a little bit trickier to use. This goes hand in hand with the rifle's nippy bullet speed, plus it makes every shot a little bit more meaningful, often allowing you to kill more players per clip. Though you'll be firing slower to account for the recoil and fire rate reduction, so it might make the gun feel a little bit less spammable, and therefore less effective within enemy territory. Whichever way you choose to use the M1 Garand, it's got a limited ammo supply, so you'll have to try and make every shot count. It might not be the most competitive semi-automatic rifle in the game, but it can still typically perform well in most scenarios, catering more so for passive-aggressive playstyles and for use over those medium distances. So that's it for another one, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video and maybe learned a few things along the way. Thumbs up if you did, and be sure to subscribe for more Battlefield videos coming up in the future. If you want to support the channel and get a few perks along the way, hit that join button now to learn more. But of course, thanks for watching. Take it easy folks, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.